Thank you, Rachel. My name is Jeff Hicke. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and Geological Sciences at the University of Idaho. I'd like to first start by thanking Rachel and others for the invitation to talk today, and for all of you for participating and being part of the conference. I was asked to speak about climate change and forest disturbances. I'm not an invasive species scientist, so I'm going to focus most of my talk on those two topics, climate change and forest disturbances. I will have a slide at the end with some of my thoughts, probably ill-informed, about how disturbances affect invasions, and I'd welcome feedback and thoughts from everyone else about that too. I'm going to focus on the three major forest disturbances of the Western US. At the top, insect outbreaks. In the bottom left, drought-induced tree mortality. In the bottom right, wildfires. And for each, I'll talk about some of the characteristics and how climate change is affecting these. Oops. Okay, starting with forest insects. The major outbreaks of forest insects in the Western US are bark beetles, an example of which is mountain pine beetle, spruce beetle, and defoliators. For an example is western spruce budworm. Both of these tend to attack conifers, or do attack conifers, because that's the major tree species or type in the Western US. The insect outbreaks tend to be widespread, as you can see from the map on the right, which is bark beetle caused tree mortality areas in the Western US in the last few decades. Most forests are affected by bark beetles, but the severity, that is the number of trees killed within a location, varies from most locations having low severity, that is the blue colors, to occasional times in locations having high severity, the orange and red colors, in which over 50% of the trees may be killed in a stand. Both types of insects are specific to individual or particular host tree species. Some insects have several different species, but are limited to only one or several. So that's important. That's important because what's left behind after an outbreak finishes are non-host tree species, the understory, including herbaceous plants and woody shrubs, and in the case at least of bark beetles, small diameter trees of the host species, which are not preferred for beetles. Climate change affects forest insect outbreaks in three different ways, or several different ways. The first is through winter temperatures. Very cold conditions kill insects, and so the warming winters that we've had over the last several decades have allowed for more survival and therefore facilitated outbreaks. Year-round temperatures govern insect life stage development rates. So with warming conditions, life stages can be completed from egg to parent or adult, and populations can therefore increase more rapidly. And then there's interaction with host trees. So first, for defoliators, important for outbreaks is the synchrony in emergence of caterpillars from winter hibernacula, which are their locations during winter. Synchrony with respect to tree bud burst or needle emergence. These early needles are most nutritious and palatable, and therefore most favorable for defoliators. And of course, synchrony is governed by temperature in many cases. Secondly, host trees have some capacity in many cases to defend themselves against attack, but stress induced by drought means less ability to do so. So as an example of how we might expect climate change in the future to affect forest insect outbreaks, I'll show you a study from my former graduate student, Polly Biot, who looked at mountain pine beetle outbreaks and whitebark pine in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. She used a statistical model or analysis and modeling and projected how future climate change would affect the winter temperatures. So the map on the left shows the number of years within a decade that have conditions that are favorable in terms of winter temperatures for mountain pine beetles. And you can see that there's some locations with fewer years that are favorable 0 to 1, for instance. That's in the blues and greens. But by the end of the century, the map on the right indicates that with a high emission scenario, the warming winters will lead to the favorable habitat or favorable conditions in wintertime for mountain pine beetle outbreaks throughout the whitebark pine habitat in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Turning now to drought. Drought affects trees in a few different ways or types. First is background mortality, in which a few trees per year per stand are killed by drought. So maybe 1 to 2% per year in locations. Low severity, but widespread, common throughout forests. This is in contrast to tree die-off events, which are associated with the uncommon but severe droughts. And these droughts lead to a high degree of tree mortality within locations. So an example of that is shown in the photograph on the right, where representing sudden aspen decline that was initiated by a drought in the early 2000s in the Rocky Mountains. Different tree species have different tolerances for drought. And so, for example, in the Southwest in the early 2000s, the major drought there caused pinyon pine mortality, but junipers were able to survive. Another characteristic of drought is that it's often coupled with bark beetle outbreaks, so that these disturbance types interact to kill trees. And then with very severe droughts, other non-tree species, such as understory herbaceous plants or shrubs, can also be killed. And so drought is somewhat species specific or vegetation type specific and somewhat not, depending on its severity. Climate change in the future, obviously, we expect to affect drought through both precipitation deficits, which I'll get into later, and the fact that warming leads to hotter droughts, which have more impacts on ecosystems. That's represented by this figure at the bottom, which is a time series of something called the Forest Drought Stress Index, developed for the Southwest based on tree rings. The FDSI, when it has positive values, there's an indicator of less stress given precipitation and temperature conditions. Negative values are more stress and lead to tree mortality. The black line are observations. You can see the early 2000s drought as being a very low value for FDSI in the Southwest. And projections of FDSI based on climate projections indicate that by 2050 or so, the average summer is going to look like, or the average conditions in terms of FDSI will look like those of the 2000s, the 2000s drought. And also you can see for context, the brown, the beige line, which is the FDSI value for the late 1500s mega drought, which was an important ecosystem disturbance in the Southwest. So pretty important impacts in terms of drought in the future. This is for the Southwest, but is likely applicable to the lower elevation, drier ecosystems of the Northwest as well. The last disturbance type are wildfires. Wildfires are clearly widespread across the Western US. They range from low severity to high severity as representing the type of and amount of vegetation killed within a fire. Crown fires, high severity fires, tend not to be specific to tree species. They just blow through a stand and kill everything. Low severity fires are surface fires. They obviously are burning the understory, the herbaceous plants. There is some tolerance to surface fires from tree species that have thick bark, such as ponderosa pine. But other tree species tend to have thinner bark and are killed by surface fires. So there's some variability in tolerance to wildfires, even low severity fires. And obviously non-tree species are affected. Climate change alters wildfires through both precipitation deficits and warming, similar to the other disturbances. The warming and precipitation deficits lead to drier fuels. They lead to longer fire seasons and greater potential for more fires and ignitions to occur. more frequent, warming leads to more frequent, the potential for more frequent burns or reburns that limit the ability for vegetation to recover between those burns and therefore increase impacts. And then the last way that I'll talk about is that warming seems to adversely affect the post-fire recovery of tree species. And I'll illustrate that with this study from Stevens Ruman, who looked at fires in the US Rocky Mountains over the course of the last few decades. The authors first looked at the change in climate during that time, and they used the annual water deficit as an indicator. So you can see before 2000, there were many blue bars indicating relatively cooler and wetter conditions, whereas the water deficit increased during the later part after 2000, indicating relatively warmer, drier conditions. The authors then looked at the seedling density at each of the number of fires that occurred in the dots on the left, plotted histograms of the two time periods pre-2000 during the cooler, wetter period. Fires during this time had a relatively low number of, there was a relatively low number of fires without seedling regeneration and with higher seedling densities. But in the post-2000 time periods when it was warmer and drier, you could see a large number of fires, fraction of fires, had no seedling regeneration, as well as a reduction in the number of fires with high amounts of seedling density. So climate seems to be playing a role in limiting tree regeneration or seedling establishment following fires. So what will happen in the future? Here are some projections of climate from the recently released IPCC report for the Pacific Northwest. This is for a high emissions scenario. The temperatures up on the upper left indicate for the Western US warming by 4 to 6 degrees, both in the wintertime and in the summertime. Precipitation is shown on the two maps on the right. Winter precipitation is expected to increase throughout much of the Western US, and that drives much of the annual totals. But importantly, during the summertime, which is the far left map, parts of the Northwest are expected to actually decrease in terms of precipitation. Soil moisture is an indicator of the combined effects of warming and changes in precipitation. And that's shown on the bottom, and you can see much of the Western US has decreases in soil moisture, which indicate adverse effects on plant growth, for instance. But also these three climate variables indicate conditions that seem to be more favorable for forest disturbances, and thus we should expect more of these to occur in the Northwest and throughout the Western US. Okay, here's my one slide about ideas on how forest disturbances may affect invasive species. These are my ideas. I'll start with fires, because fires kill and remove a lot of vegetation, including the understory, shrubby plants, and in some cases the overstory. I would suggest that this disturbance type is more favorable for invasion by plants. Forest insects, on the other hand, are very host tree species specific, so that what they don't attack and kill are the understory, small diameter trees, in the case of bark beetles, and non-host species. Forest is more intact after an outbreak happens, and so perhaps that's less favorable for invasions. And then drought is somewhat tree species specific depending on its severity, so I might call that sort of intermediate favorability between insects and fires. But again, I welcome your comments about that. So to summarize, I showed you characteristics about three major forest disturbances in the Western US: insect outbreaks, drought, and wildfires. For each of these, we know that climate is a major driver, and based on projected climate change, it appears that good conditions in the future will lead to more severe, frequent, extensive disturbances. And my suggestion is, though, that whether this climate change will affect invasive species may depend a lot on the disturbance type and the type of forest. So thank you very much.